to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. This is a propaganda analysis of an article written at The Federalist titled, No, George Will, Individual Freedom is Bigger Than Market Choice. 10 propaganda points on getting in picture from a bad angle of him not smiling. Also, when talking about the economics section of your website, why would you focus on an individual, George Will, instead of the idea he is putting forward? So if he's putting forward idea X, why wouldn't you criticize the idea instead of a very fallible person? Well, obviously the answer is it's harder to get people to get emotionally attached to a person. George Will? I don't know that guy. Screw him and his policies. Article begins. There was a time when I read George Will religiously. Oh, religiously. So it's not that George Will had some really good arguments. Here they are, A, B, and C. I disagreed with X, Y, and Z, but he was still great overall. He just read him religiously. And this whole I used to is much like, yeah, I used to be a libertarian. I used to believe X, and then I evolved, and then I progressed. But now today I'm smarter. So it's to portray him as not being biased. See, I used to like him. So it's not like I'm just, bashing some guy. I used to like him. My parents gave me a volume of his columns for Christmas when I was 13, if I remember. Ooh, vitally important. Yeah, I hope there's a correction on whether or not he was 13 or 14. He was my introduction to Aristotle and Edmund Burke, to James Madison and Alexis de Tocqueville. So that is what he learned from George Will. How about the ideas? Why not list great points that George Will made? I mean, you used to read the guy religiously. Imagine, I know about Christianity. There's like Moses and Jesus. No ideas? Well, then you really didn't do in-depth research. If all you learned from an author was other authors, come on. Will was a teacher as well as a commentator in his writing, and I learned much from him. Oh, please, deprive us of the knowledge. Let us guess what it is. And back then, he was still a conservative. Make sure not to define the term conservative when you're engaging in propaganda. It allows you to call anything you like conservative and anything you don't like, liberal and dumb and anti-conservative and anti-patriotic, if not treasonous. The ambiguity really allows the propagandist to engage in tons of name-calling and negative word association. Neo-Confederate. Times change. So this is a whole sentence. When the author is trying to pace and lead you or prime you to agree with them, they'll say dumb, obvious things that are just true. Times change. No, time stays the same. Well, by definition, it changes. Look, we don't agree on everything. No two people agree on everything. Look, no one's perfect. Well, duh, no one's perfect. You're just saying a dumb, obvious thing to get me to agree with other nonsense. Oh, well, if he's right about times changing, maybe he's right about George Will being a moron. These days, Will spends his columns sneering. Oh, he's sneering. So he doesn't put forward any economic ideas. He doesn't make historical references. He doesn't make any principled moral positions. He just sneers at Donald Trump and the rural, non-college educated working class. He sneers at the working class? Is that what happens? Or does he criticize an idea the non-college educated working class tends to align with? If I criticize an idea held by every single one of Elizabeth Warren's supporters, and they're all working class, or 90% of them are, am I criticizing the working class? Or am I disagreeing with an idea they have? Bashing. Ooh, bashing. So he's just sneering at ideas and he's just bashing them. He's not really coming up with any good arguments. He's just bashing and sneering. Pro-worker. How do you know what is pro-worker and what is anti-worker? I've lost jobs before and I then got better ones. So it was bad temporarily, but long-term it was better. Do you know that people going out of business and consumers having different values as time goes on? Don't you remember times change? Since times change, consumers value different things at different times and want to buy from different businesses. I'm sure you're devastated that we used to have 80% of Americans employed in agriculture, and now it's only 2%. Oh, therefore, unemployment's at 78%. Oh, how anti-worker of the government to not outlaw all machinery. No, you don't know what's in the best interest of 100 million strangers you've never met. Pro-worker trade policies and pro-family tax reforms. Not really sure what the pro-family tax reforms. All taxation is theft. So if Trump is lowering taxes on families, good, and do the same for non-families and everyone else. And in today's installment, he dismisses my call to revive American community as an affront to capitalism. Okay, again, he just sneers and he bashes and he dismisses. It's not like, in response to my call to revive, Will said A, B, and C. He just goes, oh, he just dismisses it. And he sneered at it and he bashed it. Oh, how terrible. My call to revive American community. Oh, how can you be against reviving American community? Oh, never mind. He is evil. I've made up my mind. As an affront to capitalism and, oh, wait for it, individual liberty. It must be hard being so angry all the time. This is an attempt to portray the opposition as, I mean, look at this guy. He's not happy. He's angry. He's not like you. Don't associate him in your mind with something powerful and virtuous and well-thinking. He's just angry. Do you know anyone who is so angry all the time? Well, that's what George Will is. Don't take anything he says seriously. Will's fulminations are typical of a certain set of Clinton and Bush-era commentators who call themselves conservative, but sound more like a cartoon version of libertarianism. Again, not defining the terms. He doesn't say, I wouldn't consider Will a conservative because a conservative I would define as X and a libertarian I would define as Z, and Will's views line more with Z than X. He doesn't say that. He just calls him a cartoon. See, he's a sneering, bashing, dismissive cartoon. That's all he is. Easy. That's much easier than addressing any of his arguments. Will shrugs. Oh, he just shrugs. He doesn't say, well, yeah, there's costs, but there's also benefits. He doesn't say that there's an economic trade-off. He just shrugs. He hasn't written a book on it. He hasn't written any articles, gone on any shows. Whenever the commentator asks him, how do you respond? He just shrugs. At the decline of the working class, well, depends on who you're defining as working class. I guess the point in that is just to say, well, you work, don't you, vast majority of people? Yeah. I support you, the working class. Well, how do you know what's in their interest? Again, there's so many intricacies when billions of people are cooperating to objectively know the interests of millions of strangers is so unlikely. So he shrugs at the decline of the working class. Also, by what metric are they declining? Were they much better 2 years ago, 10 years ago, 30, 50, 100 years ago? I'm not sure. If you're saying there's been a decline, you should maybe give us a reference point, just a general decade. Things were much better in this decade as opposed to now. But keeping it nice and vague, just like not defining your terms, is of vital importance when engaging in propaganda. According to the work of Johann Norberg in his book Progress, he says things are objectively better by every metric generally. Of course, some individuals, someone got murdered today and that person is worse off than they were yesterday, of course. Generally, there's never been a better time to be alive. And the loss of the communities that sustain them. Does Will really shrug at that? I mean, or is he saying that government isn't the solution? I would be shocked if he did. He celebrates, instead, the spontaneous order of a market society. You know, it is pretty amazing, the spontaneous order. If you look at the iPencil essay by Leonard Read, he does talk about it's kind of amazing how we don't have a central planner for the pencil. I mean, how do you decide how the wood is made, or how the chainsaw cuts down the wood, or who drives the chainsaw to work in the forest to cut down the wood? How are the tires made that get that truck there? Well, people have to do it. They have to live. How is that food made? it is rather spontaneous how these millions of things can work together to make something that no one person planned. So, yeah, there is a lot behind that idea. It's not just something you can put in quotes and then easily dismiss. By which he apparently means, so instead of asking him for a quote, this is a former senator who wrote this. He couldn't get a quote from George Will. He couldn't cite one of his many appearances. He couldn't cite anything in his book. He just says, he apparently means, instead of getting a quote, a lot easier. Woke capital. So the conservative audience will say, woke capital? Well, I'm against that. Okay, that's one bad check mark against Will. Offshoring, which the term offshoring assumes outside of national boundaries. Is trade with Hawaii offshore? Is trade with Alaska offshore? Trade with Puerto Rico? Is trade with Mexico and Canada not offshore? Offshoring is just to say he believes in these distant foreign things very unlike you. And the growing corporatist alliance between big government and big business, growing? I think it was around 1910, J.P. Morgan and his buddies, Frank Vanderlip, he had Nelson Aldrich in on the deal, wrote the Federal Reserve Act giving the state a monopoly on the currency and granting it to one bank. The growing, see, the term growing, this is totally new. We haven't been here before. This is like no other president in history. This is so different. That's why we're calling for more trade barriers. That's why we're calling for all these economic antitrust pieces of legislation, because now there's a growing corporatist alliance. It's always been there. I think Smedley Butler in the 20s said, hey, big government and big business and the military are sort of conspiring to get us into wars based on lies that are unjustified, that commit atrocities. I think Eisenhower mentioned something similar. This isn't new. But of course, they have to address it as new. It's like, hey, conservatives, remember when we used to believe in the free market, way back never? The reason we're going to change that openly instead of just hiding it is because things are different now. Right now, big business and big government are starting to work together. Wow, this is so new. Will advises working families displaced by lost jobs and neighborhoods to shut up and move. Wouldn't it be easier to quote him instead of mind reading and saying shut up and move? Does he actually say anything close to shut up and move? Or does he just say the coercively funded state shouldn't interfere in voluntary interactions? Some people might have to move in order to improve their living standards. What's the alternative? Where everyone lives right now is exactly where they should live for all of eternity, regardless of what happens. Well, look, there's unexpected things. Sometimes moving is the answer. Sometimes staying where you are is the answer. Like the Joad family in Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Much like how the left will talk about, like the Industrial Revolution, where the children were working in factories. They implant this idea into your mind that Will advises to go to Grapes of Wrath time, trying to associate those ideas with one another. Guy who works very long days for low pay. Yeah, low pay compared to today's. However, standards in the 1800s were drastically rising compared to the agricultural revolution or the 1600s or the 1500s. So it's all relative. But of course, he just compares it to the Grapes of Wrath, just like the leftists will say, oh, just like Carnegie and those terrible factories. Even though they were safer than working in the agricultural fields, everyone getting tons of skin cancer. Packing up all their belongings and abandoning their family. Who says you have to abandon things? You can sell them off, get the money, and develop new land. Packing up all their belongings and abandoning their family farm. So, was this the farm that just always existed? Or did people move here from Europe? Oh, they abandoned their homelands and then just picked up and moved. Oh, and is he talking about people in the West Coast? They just came here for the gold rush. They moved and they abandoned their family, whatever they were doing on the East Coast, freezing to death in the northern, eastern parts of the U.S. Moving is bad. Improving your life by going elsewhere is bad. Demonstrated the Joad's dignity, Will opines. Interesting. He might want to reread Steinbeck. This is called hurdling, where you say, yeah, you might want to take a history class. Oh, yeah, you might want to take a trip to Somalia. It's creating an unreasonable, unnecessary, high criteria in order for someone to respond to your argument by just saying, until you deal with burden X, which is huge, then maybe I'll take you seriously. It would take so much time to reread Grapes of Wrath, and what would you learn from it? I doubt if George Will reread it, he would then start believing that violence is justified when the state engages in it. But the senator just doesn't want to define conservatism or libertarianism or explain why the state is a unique institution in the first place. Or Edmund Burke, saying he might want to reread Steinbeck, or Edmund Burke. Will casts himself as a champion of individual liberty. Oh, he casts himself? Not that Will believes individual liberty consists of X. He just sort of calls himself this. It's just like a self-nickname. But his reduction, George Will is reducing you. He's lowering you. Don't you want to be high, up, elevated, and patriotic with us, the conservatives who believe in large states? His reduction of individual freedom to market choice, the right to buy cheap stuff from China. No? See, believing in freedom and believing in commercial freedom is just a consistent follow-up. We could reread this sentence. You believe that all individuals should voluntarily choose who they start a life with and how many hours they work. And by that you mean people should sit around, eat Doritos all day, and sleep around and get tons of STDs. See, you can just take the most negative straw man version of what someone could do with their individual freedom and make it look like a pretty cheap trade-off. It's like, you want to be reduced to buying cheap stuff from China? That's all it's about? No, it's about if you want. It's like, let's say you are, pro-worker. Let's say Bill is a worker and he wants to buy something from China. If you embrace free trade, as I do, as George Will does, and many libertarian anarcho-capitalists, you say, you know what, Bill? I really think I could offer you a better deal domestically in America. Please buy my stuff. Since I'm pro-worker, I will support you and your choice, Mr. Worker. Is it pro-worker to say anyone who buys outside of this arbitrary line called America, we get to throw in a cage? And hey, worker, if you want to buy something overseas, we're going to take more of your money by force and give it to the kind, virtuous government. Is that being pro-worker? Give me your money or we'll cage you. We'll forcibly stop you from purchasing things you voluntarily wish to have because they were made on this arbitrary area instead of this one. What about being pro-states? I mean, why should someone in California offshore jobs to New York or Florida or Maine? Shouldn't we just stay within our states or stay within our towns or stay within our race or stay within our continent? It's completely arbitrary, nonsensical lines he's drawing here. Wouldn't have made any sense to Burke. So George Will's policy wouldn't have made sense to Edmund Burke. Does that matter? Would Edmund Burke have known about the efficiency of planes and steamships? What would Edmund Burke's thoughts on Amazon be? How do you know he wouldn't be for anything voluntary? Because trade restrictions have the state initiate violence against peaceful workers, and I'm pro-worker. How do you know that's what his position would be? Or the American founders, or the voters who cast their ballots for Donald Trump. This is excellent propaganda by the senator here. He says, this paragraph alone, he says, Will wants to reduce you to buying cheap stuff from China, foreign land, not something easy that you could associate with the Chinese. The British, we speak the same language, China. That's so foreign. They're not part of us. Wouldn't have made any sense. You're dismissing. If you spoke with Edmund Burke, he'd say you don't make any sense. To the great philosopher. He's then insinuating the American founders, people who use the ideas of philosophy to forcibly resist a government who many on the right tend to look up to. You wouldn't want to not make any sense to them, or the voters who cast their ballots for Donald Trump. Okay, voters by every metric are completely ignorant on history, economics, politics, morality, logical fallacies, civics, etc. So the fact that they wouldn't, it wouldn't make any sense to them actually makes perfect sense. In the same way, when the guy at Pep Boys talks about my car, doesn't make any sense to me, even if he tries to dumb it down. It's not something I've taken the time to get informed of. So he says, he uses the argument from intimidation to show disapproval. You wouldn't agree with Burke, hitting him on the philosophical, intellectual grounds, or the American founders, hitting him in the heart where it emotionally feels. The American founders, I'm part of a country, I'm part of something bigger. They founded this for our freedom. And he's appealing to popularity. You wouldn't be popular with 63 million people. How could 63 million voters be wrong? Well, they're all educated by the state and they watch mainstream media. Burke understood. Oh, he understood. Not he made the argument. He understood. Will sneers and bashes. Burke understands that individual freedom is formed by culture and community. And you have to work to defend both. Excellent statement. I agree with everything. The non sequitur is completely hidden, as all excellent propaganda involves, by saying we need culture and community. And by the way, I believe the state has the right to initiate violence against peaceful people and implement antitrust and protectionist policies. It's not said there, but it's implied, obviously. I mean, who is against culture and community? When a libertarian says we believe in the non-aggression principle, are they talking about people can't initiate violence against yourself? Logically, that can't happen. You can't, just like you can't rape yourself or enslave yourself. It only applies to other people or a community. That's when the libertarian principles matter. And you have to work to defend both. So yeah, I'm for culture, I'm for community, I'm for anything voluntary. The little platoons, Burke said, home and church, school and neighborhood are where we grow, where we learn to love, where we find the strength and support to make something of our lives. Excellent line. I'm a big fan of homes. I have one myself. And church. Churches are a great place to meet people and, believe it or not, talk about some very interesting philosophical ideas, depending on what church. There's a great amount of intellectual diversity. School, well, I prefer educational center. The term school is a little off. And neighborhood. That's great. Living in a neighborhood you feel comfortable in. You know your neighbors. You can have your kids play outside. All terrific things. Nothing here is in conflict with supporting libertarianism or the non-aggression principle. Have a home, have a church, have a school, have a neighborhood, whatever. Just participate voluntarily and fund it voluntarily. That's all we're saying. So by invoking these things, home, church, school, and neighborhood, George Will's a libertarian and he's against these things. Libertarians are against these things. Support the state. All the non sequiturs are so beautifully built into this propaganda piece. And where we grow, learn, I said that. And they are where we forge the common bonds that sustain our national sense of purpose. How about our racial sense of purpose? How about our state sense of purpose? How about our religious sense of purpose or our spiritual? You can have wherever you find meaning, do it so long as it's voluntary. No one's saying you can't have common bonds. Oh, is that a common bond happening over there? No, I'm a libertarian. I'm against that. We say anything voluntarily is totally justified. And moron senator takes that to mean that we're against forming common bonds that sustain our sense of purpose. To the contrary, a lot of these great churches, the state sees as hurdles to their monopoly on authority. You have commandments that say don't kill, don't steal. Oh, I think we're coming into that little church in Waco. You're gonna start preaching that stuff. So of course, the state is the great hurdle to us having a common bond. Anything we do voluntarily is legitimate. The problem today, oh, yes, that's right, times change, and today is so different that our principles need to be completely thrown out the window. The problem today is that our little platoons are faltering under relentless pressure from the global economy. Look, I know it's hard. Doesn't justify initiating violence, doesn't justify the state engaging in violence. We're under a lot of pressure. Therefore, the Catholic Church and the Church of Scientology get to force us to say who we can trade with, who we can trade in what amount with, and who we can work for, and who we can associate with, and who we can buy from. It's a non sequitur. That Will loves and China exploits. Oh, so it's nice that the conservatives have taken a break from associating us with terrorists and just the communist Chinese government. China exploits it. What do you want to give in to China? You're reducing us back to Chinese exploits. How do you know that China's exploiting it? If the U.S. is giving them Federal Reserve notes, which are diminishing in value, and the Chinese are giving us goods, isn't that the purpose of money, to get the product and service? And the money is just the medium? So they get the medium, and the U.S. gets the actual product or service. Who's exploiting who? And the ceaseless denigration of cultural elites. Yeah, look, I know there's more competition, and I'm sorry. The invention of the car means that if you were popular in your neighborhood, people then had more popular people that they could associate with, and they might not choose you. I'm sorry. Look, when people have more options, they shop other places, they hang out with other people, they date other people than previously. They're not initiating violence by choosing something else. Therefore, the state has no right to forcibly stop them. Statistics tell us we face an epidemic of loneliness and isolation across all segments of our society. Well, of course, the state monopolizes welfare and says, don't take care of each other. You have Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps and Social Security. So, yeah, obviously that is what we're going to see as the Bismarckian welfare state intended. Face an epidemic of loneliness and isolation across all segments of our society. So this is the different mindset that the conservative versus the principled thinker or libertarian has. There is a problem in this place. The problem is loneliness and isolation. I want to solve that problem so bad it's not even funny. I'm open to any voluntary method of solving it. So it's not that you don't want the government to mandate who grows food and force people to control it and force people to pick cotton and whip them if they resist. So you don't want food? Don't you know there's an epidemic and a possible food shortage coming? Look, anything voluntary. I don't trust the state to enforce these things. The fact that you're giving us statistics of the existence of a problem. Oh, don't you know divorce is high? Yeah, told you. That's why the Catholic Church should tell everyone who they're allowed to marry. And you have to get a special license from the church. I mean, don't you know statistics show that divorce is high and then families break up and then people commit suicide? You don't care about those families? It's all a non sequitur, saying problem X exists, therefore state intervention, violent intervention, is legitimate. Deaths of despair are soaring. Suicides, drug overdoses, and alcoholism together claim more lives now than ever in our history. I hate that is the case, and I'm up for solving those problems through any voluntary means possible. And Americans' participation in civic groups and social gatherings continue to decline. Well, of course, you had mutual aid societies before the welfare state. So that's exactly what we'd expect from government intervention, the very thing the senator here is saying we need to embrace. Even as a whole, neighborhoods and towns wither. Look, things wither as people move and people have different preferences. I'm very sad at the withering of Blockbuster and Sears and MySpace, but that just because I'm sad that those things are gone doesn't mean you have a right to force people to stop engaging in voluntary exchanges. As the little platoons fade, so too does our sense of individual agency and national belonging. That is legit. I definitely believe that if people have a little more freedom, they are more likely to engage in individual preferences rather than constantly have to think of the group. But that doesn't justify. I mean, the people leaving the Jonestown cult felt no longer had a sense of belonging. to give their lives away for Phil Jones, Jim Jones. Yeah, that's a good thing. That's not too much of an exaggeration to say when people have a sense of national belonging, they don't look into why the Lusitania sunk, and they're happy to applaud kids going off to war and dying in wars. It's not much different from drinking the Kool-Aid to joining the war based on lies that engages in mass murder and mass death. Doesn't that also separate people from families? Isn't that also a bad result? All the things that government does? More Americans report feeling powerless and unheard than ever before. Really? Because don't you have democracy where someone gets to vote? And that's where all the power is. That's where they can be heard. Were people heard more in the 90s, 70s, 60s, 40s, the 20s? When were they more heard than they are now with YouTube and Twitter and Facebook? And all these other things. And so you're openly saying, even though more people are engaging in democracy than ever before, people are less heard than ever before. That really throws a wrench in the whole democracy exists to reflect our ideas. Burke would have understood why. Whereas Will sneers and just shrugs off and tells people to shut up, Burke understands why. Without the fellowship of our shared communities, no one generation can link with the other, Burke said. Men would become little better than the flies of summer. So, look, anything voluntary, anything peaceful, whether it's a book club or a church community or a gun rights community that there's a lot of in Arizona, anything that gives you a sense of purpose. I mean, Nick Fuentes made the point of, it's really important that we whites not only see each other horizontally as sharing goals with all other existing whites or just people within a certain nation, but also vertically through both our ancestors and descendants, moving towards progress and becoming prosperous. I'm not really sure what else he meant, but he said this in his discussion with Adam Kokesh, and that is totally fine. You could call it an organization or a charity or a corporation or just people who communicate, hey, today I did A, B, and C for the race and the nation, and here's what I'm going to do tomorrow for the nation since we're acting collectively and I know what's best for the collective. I don't believe that's the case, but there's nothing terrible about doing that. Just do it voluntarily. There are many causes of the crisis, including faulty economic and trade policy that has favored the highly educated front row over the working class for decades. I'm not really sure what this is. The idea that just the elites are running things, therefore the people need to take them back. 320 million people in America. What percentage are going to be involved in the policy that changes the current economic plans that the U.S. has, the NAFTA or TPP? You want them to get a front row? By every metric, they're uneducated. Why do you want the uneducated people leading the way? I don't want the highly educated either. I just want freedom. Shit. And a conception of freedom pushed relentlessly by academia and cultural leaders that degenerates community, church, and home. That is obviously true with the Frankfurt School pushing cultural Marxism. By there not being a strong community, well, the state has less of a hurdle towards its monopoly on authority. I already said this with the church. So yeah, that's definitely happening. I support any peaceful, voluntary means of bringing people together to work towards common goals, feel a sense of nationhood and belonging and spiritual purpose. Just make it voluntarily. Will is offended. Oh, he's offended. Again, he doesn't have reasons. He's just offended. Will is an SJW. He's offended. His feelings are hurt. He's a little child. Why is he so angry all the time? Remember the picture from above? All nonsense. Will is offended. I would broach any of these subjects. Is he really? Is he offended, or does he just disagree on principle that government is violence and the state isn't the solution to any of these issues? He purports not to recognize the facts that I describe. Oh, don't quote him. Just say that he purports Don't list any of his responses. Just say that he purports. He really ought to get out more. Oh, he stays inside, and he's so angry all the time. He's isolated. These are the ideas of an angry, isolated man who really should get out more. You don't agree with him, do you? The individualism he lauds as a theory is, in fact, much more than that. The individualism he lauds as a theory is, in fact, much more than that. Oh, yeah. Yep, it absolutely is. But saying that you have a principled foundation for something doesn't mean that involves everything. Oh, you believe in home, community, church, and neighborhoods? Life's a lot more, is about a lot more than that. I mean, there's food. You didn't mention food, and without that, we'd starve and die. You didn't mention water. You didn't mention how to build houses. I mean, life's about much more than that, don't you know? Well, obviously, but that's not what he is discussing when he's saying a general principle for how individuals should cooperate. He's saying it's just a theory. It's nothing that we have any example of in practice. People choosing different things is not an example of free trade. We don't have a free dating market. We don't have, the unregulated ideas of anyone can have as many children as they want. We don't have a lack of regulation on, before you choose a career, you have to get the state's permission. There is a lot of licensing. I guess I take that back. How about, hey, before you write an article, is this in the nation's best interest? You need to get votes by the nation whether this article should be able to be published. I mean, are you like one of these rugged individualists who just thinks you can do all this on his own? Oh, Josh Hawley, a U.S. Senator from Missouri, only he wrote this. He didn't get any advice from the pro-workers. He's just one of these people that gets elites to sit on the front row over the working class. Why don't you publish my work? I'm working class. You hate the working class. I'm sorry this has gotten annoying, and it's long, but it's almost over. It is a way of life that needs defending. Absolutely. It does need defending, especially against senators and states, the number one cause of genocide and economic destruction. It's a shame he won't defend it any longer. Well, he will defend it. He just believes in voluntarily organized defense. He doesn't believe that putting the state in charge of anything is morally justified, nor is it economic. Thank you for watching Keith Knight. Don't tread on anyone. This was a propaganda analysis of the Federalist.